Hello, and welcome to the Fearless Floyd Show. The following article was written after the USA invaded Iraq, and the parallel to Venezuela is remarkable. President Trump has seized oil tankers from Venezuela and other countries, as well as seizing 50 million barrels of oil from Venezuela off the top. You are witnessing vulture capitalism. What exactly is vulture capitalism? Vulture capitalism refers to a practice where investors, often through hedge funds or private equity firms, acquire financially distressed companies with the intent of generating profit through aggressive cost-cutting measures, asset stripping, and eventual resale. These investors typically target firms on the brink of bankruptcy, purchasing them at significantly discounted prices due to their vulnerable financial state. Once acquired, vulture capitalists often implement drastic measures such as mass layoffs, reduction of employee benefits, and the sale of key assets to increase short-term profitability and shareholder returns. This approach is criticized for prioritizing immediate financial gain over long-term business sustainability and social welfare, leading to job losses and economic inefficiency. The term is metaphorically derived from the vulture bird, which scavenges on the remains of dead animals, symbolizing the predatory nature of these investors. While some argue that such interventions help reallocate capital to more efficient uses and prevent the waste of resources by failing firms, critics emphasize the social and economic costs, including the erosion of worker livelihoods and the concentration of wealth among a small elite. The concept is closely linked to leveraged buyouts and financial engineering, where debt is used to finance acquisitions, and profits are extracted through asset sales or high-interest lending to the acquired firm. Grace Blakely's 2025 book Vulture Capitalism, Corporate Crimes, Backdoor Bailouts, and the Death of Freedom offers a critical analysis of the system, arguing that modern capitalism is not a free market but a planned economy orchestrated by large corporations, financial institutions, and state actors working in tandem to consolidate power and wealth. Blakely contends that this alliance undermines democracy, stifles competition, and results in systemic inequality, with governments often bailing out corporations while ordinary citizens bear the brunt of economic downturns. Her work positions vulture capitalism as a central mechanism through which elite interests are preserved and expanded, even as the broader economy suffers. The debate around vulture capitalism remains polarized. Proponents argue that such practices are essential for economic efficiency and creative destruction, allowing capital and labor to shift toward more productive sectors. However, critics maintain that the current system is not about market competition but about institutionalized privilege, where the state and corporate power collaborate to maintain monopolistic control and extract value from the public. This dynamic, they argue, has led to a new Gilded Age and a war between monopoly power and democracy. The Shock Doctrine, The Rise of Disaster Capitalism is a 2007 book by Canadian author and social activist Naomi Klein that presents a critical analysis of the global rise of neoliberal economic policies through the lens of what she terms disaster capitalism. Klein argues that political and economic actors exploit crises such as natural disasters, wars, coups, and market crashes to implement radical free market reforms, including privatization and deregulation, under the guise of recovery and reconstruction. The book traces the origins of this strategy to the 1973 Chilean coup that brought General Augusto Pinochet to power, where economists known as the Chicago Boys, trained under Milton Friedman, implemented shock therapy economic policies. Klein further examines how this model was applied in subsequent events, including the 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and the 1997 Asian financial crisis, where disasters were leveraged to advance corporate interests and dismantle public services. The book was widely acclaimed, winning the 2009 Warwick Prize for Writing and being named one of the best books of 2007 by several major publications. While some critics, such as Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, questioned the book's methodology and perceived oversimplifications, others praised its investigative depth and narrative power, with The Guardian calling it one of the few books that truly help us understand the present. The Shock Doctrine in Action in New Orleans. December 21, 2007, by Naomi Klein. Readers of the shock doctrine know that one of the most shameless examples of disaster capitalism has been the attempt to exploit the disastrous flooding of New Orleans to close down that city's public housing projects, some of the only affordable units in the city. Most of the buildings sustained minimal flood damage, but they happen to occupy valuable land that make for perfect condo developments and hotels. The final showdown over New Orleans public housing is playing out in dramatic fashion right now. The conflict is a classic example of the triple shock formula at the core of the doctrine. First came the shock of the original disaster, the flood and the traumatic evacuation. Next came the economic shock therapy, using the window of opportunity opened up by the first shock to push through a rapid-fire attack on the city's public services and spaces, most notably its homes, schools, and hospitals. Now we see that as residents of New Orleans try to resist these attacks, they are being met with a third shock, the shock of the police baton and the taser gun, used on the bodies of protesters outside New Orleans City Hall yesterday. Democracy Now! Has been covering this fight all week, with amazing reports from filmmakers Jackie Sahen and Rick Rowley. Rick was arrested in the crackdown. For more context, here are a couple of related excerpts from the shock doctrine, the rise of disaster capitalism. The news racing around the shelter, in Baton Rouge, that day was that Richard Baker, a prominent Republican congressman from this city, had told a group of lobbyists, "We finally cleaned up public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did." Joseph Canizaro, one of New Orleans' wealthiest developers, had just expressed a similar sentiment. "I think we have a clean sheet to start again. And with that clean sheet we have some very big opportunities." All that week the Louisiana state legislature in Baton Rouge had been crawling with corporate lobbyists helping to lock in those big opportunities: lower taxes, fewer regulations, cheaper workers, and a smaller, safer city, which in practice meant plans to level the public housing projects and replace them with condos. Hearing all the talk of fresh starts and clean sheets, you could almost forget the toxic stew of rubble, chemical outflows, and human remains just a few miles down the highway. Over at the shelter, Jamar Perry, a young resident of New Orleans, could think of nothing else. "I really don't see it as cleaning up the city. What I see is that a lot of people got killed uptown. People who shouldn't have died." He was speaking quietly, but an older man in line in front of us in the food line overheard and whipped around. "What is wrong with these people in Baton Rouge? This isn't an opportunity. It's a goddamned tragedy. Are they blind?" A mother with 2 kids chimed in. "No, they're not blind, they're evil. They see just fine." At first I thought the green zone phenomenon was unique to the war in Iraq. Now, after years spent in other disaster zones, I realize that the green zone emerges everywhere that the disaster capitalism complex descends, with the same stark partitions between the included and the excluded, the protected and the damned. It happened in New Orleans. After the flood, an already divided city turned into a battleground between gated green zones and raging red zones, the result not of water damage but of the free market solutions embraced by the president. The Bush administration refused to allow emergency funds to pay public sector salaries, and the city of New Orleans, which lost its tax base, had to fire 3,000 workers in the months after Katrina. Among them were 16 of the city's planning staff with shades of debathification, laid off at the precise moment when New Orleans was in desperate need of planners. Instead, millions of public dollars went to outside consultants, many of whom were powerful real estate developers. And of course thousands of teachers were also fired, paving the way for the conversion of dozens of public schools into charter schools, just as Friedman had called for. Almost 2 years after the storm, Charity Hospital was still closed. The court system was barely functioning, and the privatized electricity company, Entergy, had failed to get the whole city back online. After threatening to raise rates dramatically, the company managed to extract a controversial $200 million bailout from the federal government. The public transit system was gutted and lost almost half its workers. The vast majority of publicly owned housing projects stood boarded up and empty, with 5,000 units slotted for demolition by the Federal Housing Authority. Much as the tourism lobby in Asia had longed to be rid of the beachfront fishing villages, New Orleans' powerful tourism lobby had been eyeing the housing projects, several of them on prime land close to the French Quarter, the city's tourism magnet. Endesha Juakali helped set up a protest camp outside one of the boarded-up projects, St. Bernard Public Housing, explaining that they've had an agenda for St. Bernard a long time, but as long as people lived here, they couldn't do it. So they used the disaster as a way of cleansing the neighborhood when the neighborhood is weakest. This is a great location for bigger houses and condos. The only problem is you got all these poor black people sitting on it. Amid the schools, the homes, the hospitals, the transit system and the lack of clean water in many parts of town, New Orleans' public sphere was not being rebuilt, it was being erased, with the storm used as the excuse. At an earlier stage of capitalist creative destruction, large swaths of the United States lost their manufacturing bases and degenerated into rust belts of shuttered factories and neglected neighborhoods. Post-Katrina New Orleans may be providing the first Western world image of a new kind of wasted urban landscape, the mold belt, destroyed by the deadly combination of weathered public infrastructure and extreme weather. The use of hydrocarbon resources under belligerent occupation, the question of the Iraqi oil. By Maurice Voyame. Introduction. Nearly 1 year ago, a small coalition of states led by the United States of America and the United Kingdom invaded Iraq and overthrown the regime of Saddam Hussein. Since the coalition force gained effective control over the territory of Iraq, accompanied by the official end of hostilities, Iraq must be regarded as occupied territory. This means a specific set of rules comes into force under which all forms of belligerent occupation shall be executed. It is important to notice that it is completely irrelevant with regard to the applicability of the rules of belligerent occupation whether the act of occupation, the use of force and how hostilities were conducted are consistent with international law. This paper tries to introduce the legal framework under which an occupying power must execute its occupation concerning the specific question of use of property under occupation with special emphasis on hydrocarbon resources. The major focus lies on the legal provisions and their development over time rather than on an in-depth examination of the current situation in Iraq. Nevertheless, a final conclusion will try to reconcile the legal arguments with some of the problems arising from the effect of belligerent occupation in Iraq at this time. General principles governing belligerent occupation. Under belligerent occupation, private and public property, including natural resources, cannot be used by the occupying power beyond the limits imposed by the regulations respecting the laws and customs of war on land as annexed to the Hague Convention 4 of 1907, and by the provisions stipulated in the Fourth Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in times of war of the 12th of August, 1949. To understand the range in which property can be used by an occupying power, it is indispensable to bear in mind the principal facts regarding the legal regime of occupation. A simple invasion of whole or parts of the territory of another state does not qualify as occupation, because the provisions regulating the rights and duties of an occupying power only come into force when the territory which shall be considered as occupied actually is placed under the control of the occupying power to the extent that this power is able to exercise authority within this territory. An occupant furthermore does not displace the legitimate sovereignty of the territory under occupation but merely executes his de facto authority as administrator over the occupied territory. This is a crucial and fundamental fact to remember when later considering the legal status of hydrocarbon resources and their use by the occupant. Property rights under belligerent occupation. In addressing the notion of property rights under belligerent occupation, of which natural resources in general and hydrocarbon resources in particular are part, 4 different types of property can be distinguished: private property and public property, sometimes also referred to as state property, and both types of property can either have the form of movable property or immovable property. The occupying power possesses different rights and duties with regard to the above specified possible types of property. In addition, 2 other concepts has to be taken into account: the concept of munitions de guerre and the modification of the ability of a belligerent occupant to exploit natural resources in the aftermath of the doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, which emerged as economic part of the right to self-determination of people under colonial rule from 1950 on. Principally, private property is protected against confiscation by virtue of art. 46 of the regulations on the laws and custom of war on land. Hence there are certain circumstances which allow limited confiscation of movable private property. The purpose of legitimate requisition of private movable property must be to support the military forces of the occupying power engaged in the occupation, and the occupant must ensure that the requisition is proportionate and does not exceed the level of what a country can bear. Whereas the requisition of movable private property is allowed under some circumstances, the seizure of immovable private property, such as sale or transfer of title of immovable private property, is prohibited. Concerning public property, the provisions of Art. 53 of Hague 4 regulate the use of public movable property without giving any definition of the term, in providing that it can be more freely taken by the occupying power, requiring that it could be used in military operations. This conclusion, which actually limits the right of the occupant to use movable public property for merely military purposes, is based on an examination of the overall context of the Hague regulations, whereas other authorities have read the provisions of Art. 53 as simply identifying the type of property the occupant can use. Regarding immovable public property, the principal observation that the occupying power does not displace the legitimate sovereign of the territory occupied and therefore cannot deal with public-owned immovable property at will is reflected in Art. 55 of Hague 4, which regulates the status of immovable state property. Art. 55 read: The occupying state shall be regarded only as administrator and usufructuary of public buildings, real estate, forests, and agricultural estates belonging to the hostile state, and situated in the occupied country. It must safeguard the capital of these properties, and administer them in accordance with the rule of usufruct. For an understanding of the range of rights and duties under the regulations in Art. 55, it is indispensable to examine the concept and meaning of usufruct. Generally speaking, the obligation that the occupant has to act in accordance to the principles of usufruct limits his power. Usufruct as such is an old doctrine originated in the Roman law and defined in the institutions Justiniani. The rule means that the occupant has the right to make use of the property and enjoy their products. These rights are without prejudice to the principle that it may not take title to them. Hence the occupying power may utilize public land and buildings, sell the crops on public land, but shall not exercise his rights in a wasteful or negligent way, and moreover has no right of disposal or sale. To give a generalized summary over the rights an occupant possesses under the Hague regulations to interfere in the economic activity of occupied territory by requisition, seizure, and use of particular categories of property, academics have argued that such an interference is generally only legal for the purpose of protecting the interests and well-being of the inhabitants, or to meet its own military security needs, or to defray the expenses involved in the belligerent occupation. The applicability of the Hague regulations becomes increasingly difficult, with the attempt to unambiguous crystallize a guidance which is capable to determine the parameters in which the occupant might execute legitimate power over natural resources. The core question we are concerned with in this paper is in how far non-renewable resources, of which hydrocarbon resources are one category, can be used by the party executing effective control in the territory of the hostile state. Several problems evolve around the question of how to classify hydrocarbon resources, in our case more precisely oil. This question comprises an analysis clarifying if oil is a private or public property, if it is already extracted and the concept of munitions dugger might kick in or not, and if oil shall be classified as movable or immovable property. It is reasonable to look on the interpretation of usufruct as a civil law concept in the legislation of civil law countries to evaluate if fluid natural resources, such as oil or water, shall be regarded as movable or immovable property, no matter if privately owned or in public hands. Fluid natural resources, and therefore also the object under examination, oil, if these resources are still in situ, have to be considered as immovable property. In this regard, many civil law countries consider water resources, like all appurtenances to real estate, to be immovable property. One consequence of the fact that oil in situ is an immovable natural resource is that the occupant cannot claim to use it under the determinants of considering it as munitions de guerre. To consider a good as munitions de guerre, it must be susceptible of direct military use, whereas crude oil in the ground would first have to be extracted and further processed to be of direct military use. Although this is a narrow interpretation of the concept of munitions de guerre, it is arguable that earlier case law determined a similar narrowness of the concept of munitions de guerre. Natural resources under belligerent occupation. With the focus on resources that still have to be extracted, we have elaborated the question of munitions de guerre and concluded that in situ oil can hardly be subsumed under this rule. Hence the question remains if and to which extent oil can be exploited under the traditional rule of usufruct, and moreover what role the doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources possesses in considering the particular case of oil, especially with regard to the current occupation of Iraq. There is little doubt that the rules of Art. 55 of the Hague Regulations grant the occupying power the right to use also natural resources to a certain amount by virtue of the concept of usufruct. But the concept of usufruct can be interpreted in a broader or narrower way, and which kind of interpretation should be regarded as most appropriate is particularly crucial when dealing with non-renewable resources such as oil. While it can be agreed that any use of natural resources can only be legitimate when its purpose is to meet the needs of the occupation itself. With regard to oil, this means that the occupant may continue to exploit existing oil wells. Nevertheless, this right is not without any restriction, because oil is a non-renewable resource and the rule of Art. 55 Hague 4 provides that the occupying state must safeguard the capital of these properties. The use of existing oil wells can only be lawful in a manner which is proportionate as compared to the degree the wells were exploited before the occupation. This is particularly important when dealing with hydrocarbon resources, which are inherently non-renewable, and a widespread use of such resources could peak in a decline of the capital of these properties. On the other hand, the rules of Art. 55 have been read in a very liberal sense in arguing that not only the exploitation of existing wells but moreover the right to exploit new oil field would be in the framework of Art. 55 because such an approach aims in the benefit of the occupied population from the fruits of the drilled oil. To assist in a more comprehensive final observation on the rule of use of hydrocarbon resources as one part of natural resources, it seems helpful to regard the concept of permanent sovereignty over natural resources, especially in territories administered and/or occupied by a third states. The doctrine recalls the principal assumption that an occupying state must fulfill its obligation to ensure also the material well-being of the inhabitants of the territory occupied. This means export and exploitation for the general grant of the home economy or the grant of oil concessions to foreign companies is prohibited. One point which strengthens this observation is the fact that peoples whose territory is occupied nevertheless keep their permanent sovereignty over their natural resources. This stipulates that, read in conjunction with the provisions of the Hague Regulations, it reaffirms in a narrower way that natural resources can only be taken on an amount that is necessary to meet the cost of occupation. Conclusion. Finally, all these findings shall be applied to the situation of an occupied Iraq and the legality of the use of oil within this territory. Iraq is occupied by coalition forces who took over the administration of the country, while the sovereignty, including the sovereignty over natural resources such as oil, remains on the state of Iraq and its people. The occupation authority is bound by the provisions of the Hague and Geneva Conventions and therefore has to follow the rules introduced in this paper. This means in practice that there might be some dispute over the practical implementation and interpretation of certain provisions, but not concerning their applicability. The Iraqi oil can only be used to meet the cost of the occupation and for the benefit of the Iraqi people. The use of the existing oil wells should not significantly exceed the amount of drilled oil before the occupation. Under no circumstances is the use of hydrocarbon resources for the benefit of the home economy of the occupying powers or another theater of war permissible, and moreover a disproportionate exploitation of immovable natural resources which significantly reduces the capital of these properties is inconsistent with the object and purposes of Art. 55 of the Hague Regulations. The occupying power will violate these principles when starting to grant private non-Iraqi companies major contracts for the exploitation of Iraqi oil. One contract, in the area of repair and reconstruction of Iraq's oil infrastructure, was recently granted to the U.S. companies Kellogg Brown and Root of Arlington. Here kicks one other major problem under the legal regime of belligerent occupation in. The occupying power has to respect the law of the state, which remain in force despite the fact of actual occupation. Iraqi law bans foreign investment and the establishment of companies in Iraq by foreigners who are not citizens of Arab countries. In fact, the Coalition Provisional Authority adopted an order, Order Number 39, which replaces all existing foreign investment laws in Iraq. This provision clearly and unambiguous violates the rules set out in Art. 43 of Hague 4 and should be abolished or not enforced before the occupation ended and a freely elected Iraqi sovereign might adopt such a legislation. Although it was stipulated that hydrocarbon resources might be used to a certain extent by the belligerent occupant under the rules of Hague 4, the development of the doctrine of permanent sovereignty over natural resources and the Schoen case law affirms that the provisions to administer public property under the guidance of usufruct and the concept of usufruct itself shall be read and applied in a narrow way. This is the blueprint for Venezuela. This is the American way. Thank you for watching and listening and spending your valuable time, energy, and money with the show. If you found value in the information herein, please like, subscribe, leave a comment below and get notified when new videos are scheduled. You can always reach the show at thefearlessfloydshow.com and email at thefearlessfloydshow@yahoo.com. Copyright 2026 Floyd Pleasant Tarvin 4. All rights reserved.